David
Oh my
Miscavige, isn't that
God.
the Scientology guy?
Yes, totally. He's on my mind too, because, where is his wife? But
That's a good question.
yeah,
That's going to get us canceled faster than saying anything against the U.S. government. You got to, we're going to have people in our house if we
there's going to
start
be
going.
like people outside my door, like filming me. Yeah.
What the hell does that even mean?
What you getting at with the book script? Spit that shit out, man!
When I was your age, television was called books.
Wait a minute. What's your favorite book?
You got the hook!
In my hand, Doc! You got it in my hand!
Burn it!
Tells me that goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning.
Welcome back to Propaganda Loves You Book Club. We are covering the last 3 chapters in the epilogue of our first book for season 2, Minority Rule by Ari Berman, The Right-Wing Attack on Democracy and the Fight to Resist It. So this week, we're as I mentioned, we're closing out the book. We're talking about these last few chapters kind of as a big, just overall picture here for these last couple chapters and what they talk about. Chapter 10 into which is called Democracy on the Ballot. Kind of talk Arthur, I think we talked about this earlier in the series, but how when you say literally democracy was on the ballot because you had a bunch of election deniers running for office, right? So that's big into that whole chapter there. Chapter 11, New School Election Denial meets Old School Voter Suppression, kind of going over what the impact of SB 202 was on the 2022 elections in Georgia. It is a shorter chapter, so I don't really have as much into that, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the margins that changed based off those voter suppression laws that were introduced. And then getting into kind of chapter 3, the gerrymandering of history. This was a longer chapter, but what I loved about this one was how it went into how the history of Reconstruction was portrayed by at the time and the counter to that Du Bois actually wrote, talking about how, history can be used as propaganda, which I think we had a whole 3-parter on that, I'm pretty sure, early season 1. And then we'll end on the epilogue, which is supposed to be the uplifting portion of the book. And I think it was for me. I mean, that was definitely, I know it was set up to be that way, but it does show there are tools and methods that can be used. And there are people thinking about how do you use the same system that can be turned into laboratory for oligarchy into laboratory for democracy. So that's what we're going to talk through today. So before I get into that, now that we've kind of finished the book, we can do a short upfront for anyone that doesn't want to listen to this entire episode. But anything for you guys after, reading through, anything you want to hit up front on these couple chapters before we go into kind of chapter 10 in depth?
I kind of thought it's kind of hard to get out of your head a lot, is this Edward Bernays connection to everything. And I don't know, it's just in my mind when reading it, Bernays, the nephew of Freud, and we talked about the Torches of Freedom campaign where he rebranded cigarettes to be Torches of Freedom. And it came across with the SAVE Act, right? With Safeguard American Voter Eligibility, and how Republicans often rename and capitulate on these matters. But really it's the action to fight that and combat it is to keep naming it and reject the name, I think. And so calling it the Present Your Papers Act or something, is much more direct of what it's going to do. So I guess for me, it was a lot of thinking of how the marketing of these Republicans acts and how they're kind of showing one thing to the public while privately, of course, reaping all the benefits and stealing everything. So that was kind of my takeaway, I guess, from the book, seeing that pattern and then just spotting it everywhere.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think, and this book is a good example of it, but I feel like we got the same thing in last season with When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katznelson, and how it's one of those moments where you're studying a thing that's going on in history, whether it's recent history, last 10 years or so, or deeper into the 20th century or beyond, where you think a simple version of the story, but then a book like this gives you all the gritty details and you really start to understand the depths to which you didn't understand what was going on. This book really does a good job of highlighting just how sinister and calculated and corrupt and manipulative all of the Republican strategizing has been throughout the whole Trump era and arguably since Obama. So yeah, it's a really good deep dive, really good reminder, even if you feel like you were politically aware during that whole period of history, how much you may have forgotten, how much you may have not even noticed when it happened. These moments that we feel like we've lived through, we feel like we know them, but then we go read a book like this and study them and we realize, oh, there was a lot of layers to this that I didn't even know about. So it's one of those kinds of experiences for me, and I've really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love both of those things. I think from like the Bernays angle, I do wonder sometimes like if Bernays specifically is someone that it's clear that it's someone that they've taken lessons from, but my wondering is like, do they go all the way back to him, or do they have like the modern book, right?
Part of the deal.
Yeah,
They
right.
got it.
So yeah, I wonder how many people are using his playbook without realizing where the I guess intellectual lineage actually comes from. But and then the other piece, Joe, what you were just saying there, I think that was my thing when I read this the first time, was like this information's just available and we're still like we're still having this conversation sometimes. Like, I think it helped solidify for me how hard it is for things to actually break through at like a national level, or really to like catch hold. And like when there's that much nuance involved, people can literally say the plan out loud at meetings, and it can be recorded and it can be public, and it still doesn't make a difference unless there's people that are actively like interpreting that and putting it out there. So yeah, agreed on those counts for sure. And with that, like getting into chapter 10, the democracy on the ballot, it's talking about the 2022 midterms, which, after 2020, all the claims of election fraud that we talked about in the previous episodes, this search for alternate electors, Eastman coming up with all these electoral theories that they could possibly do to throw out the whole election and get Trump back in power, like after talking about all that and the lawsuits that they put on. So now it's the 2022 midterm election, so the election immediately following this, where you have a significant amount of people that are on the ballot that were part of the election denial scheme, essentially. So people that wanted to overturn the democratically elected representatives are now running for positions of power that would enable them to do that in some of these cases. Like Secretary of State, I think in a lot of places, is the one that actually controls ballot access, voter rolls, and all of this information. And I think like 2022 is when Kari Lake was running in Arizona, Doug Mastrino was running in Pennsylvania, and these are all people that were denying the 2020 election. But what I wanted to focus on, where I wanted to start reading, was actually around this GOP operative. Her name's Cleta Mitchell. And I wanted to talk a little bit about her, so some context on her before I get into this reading part. She's a veteran Republican elections lawyer. She spent most of her career as counsel for the NRSC and the NRCC, and she was kind of, along with Eastman, one of the lead legal minds, I guess what you call it, that was working to help try and overturn the 2020 election. So I wanted to kind of get into her story a little bit more. I'm going to start reading here on page 226. So I'm going to start here. 2 days after the 2020 election, Cleta Mitchell, a veteran GOP elections lawyer who called herself the consigliere to a vast right-wing conspiracy, I'm going to repeat that, who called herself the consigliere to a vast right-wing conspiracy, emailed her longtime friend John Eastman. The movement is stirring, she told Eastman, but needs constitutional support. She asked Eastman if he could write a legal memo outlining the constitutional role of state legislators in designating electors. As a former state legislator in Oklahoma from 1976 to 1984, Mitchell believed that where state exec branch officials have rewritten or ignored state election law, the legislatures had the power to reclaim the constitutional duty and designator of the electors, regardless of the popular vote winner in the state, which Mitchell claimed was merely advisory. Am I crazy? She asked. At least to Eastman, she was not. By November 28th, she had produced a 7-page memo for POTUS agreeing with Mitchell's assertion that the state legislatures and executive authority determined the method for appointing presidential electors, giving them the power to override the choice of the voters. Legislators simply must investigate, he wrote, and then if convinced that the election was too fraught with the risk of fraud to be properly certified, exercise their prerogative to legislatively designate a slate of electors. In the following weeks, Mitchell helped lead the legal effort to overturn the election, and Eastman provided the constitutional theory behind it. A day after the election, Mitchell was in Montana working for a Republican Senate candidate when she received a call from the White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows. He asked her to go to Atlanta and investigate the vote count. She was on the next flight. She quickly began assembling lawyers to challenge results in Georgia, whom she called Team Deplorables. On January 2nd, she participated in the call where Trump asked Raffensperger to find 11,780 votes to nullify Biden's win. She repeated several false claims about the election, alleging that 18,000 ballots were scanned at the State Farm Arena after GOP poll monitors were ejected, and that 4,500 people voted in Georgia who were registered out of state. Those numbers that we got, that Miss Mitchell was just saying, they're not accurate, Ryan Germany, counsel for the Secretary of State, responded. When Mitchell's participation in the call became public, she was forced to leave the white shoe law firm in Washington, D.C., where she'd been a longtime partner, representing the who's who of GOP candidates, including Trump, the conservative organizations like the National Rifle Association. She landed as a senior fellow at the Conservative Partnership Institute, where an American First think tank run by Meadows after he left the White House, and former Heritage Foundation President Jim DeMint. It had become a kind of Trump administration in exile, funded by Trump's PAC and other top right-wing donors, and housing at least 20 key operatives who tried to overturn the election. So I want to pause there for a second. So we're talking about the 2020 election still, and this was her talking to Eastman. I think that the big thing, that the reason I wanted to pause here was a couple things. Recently, I think it was John Ossoff that played the clip of Trump in that phone call asking to find 11,780 votes in Georgia. And so, like, this is, as of today, when Trump is pushing the Senate to pass the Save America Act because of voter fraud, we have Trump on phone call asking to overturn the will of the people in an election. And so I think, like, that kind of sets up who these people are, right? These are the legal minds that are actually trying to push this theory that Trump could have overturned the 2020 election, and that the popular vote was a suggestion and not something that the legislators had to follow, that they could basically assign their own legislatures, which would assumingly vote the way they wanted to, and send them to Congress instead. Or sorry, I'm saying legislators, I mean electors. So I just think that's good to kind of, I don't know, wrap your head around as you're thinking about these characters. Like, that's how they got started. And the other thing that, to me, I don't know what you guys think about this, but just this Trump administration in exile being funded by a super PAC that who knows where this money is coming from, but just to keep that process churning and keep working on these election denial schemes. Like, where my head's going is like, how do you get the Democratic counterpart to that, right? Like these things that are running off of ostensibly campaign funds that were sent to Trump's super PAC that was supposed to help him get elected, but just continues to run this political machinery outside of presidential election years. I don't know. Do you guys have any interesting or any thoughts on either of those things before we go into the 2022 part of this?
Yeah, I kind of found the chapter like a bit hopeful at first because a lot of those people lost at the top level there. I mean, of course, Berman goes on to discuss how down the ticket, some people won, and that is a little scary, for the lower rung positions, because they actually do control a lot of things and they're going to work their way up. And it kind of led me to like this thought that I think you said just before this discussion of the chapter, which is that like the kind of boring stuff just goes by people, and it's only when it's like super interesting that we show up. So people showed up for the really interesting elections of who's on the docket, but when it came to like county commissioner and stuff, some of those seats are run unopposed. So what can you even do? And yeah, I think I'm totally with you too, where I found like the Democratic Party floundering. Like, this is what the GOP is doing with their money. The DNC, I got no good words. So it's hard. I do like, is it David Miscavige, the younger person who...
David Hogg. David Hogg.
Why do I keep saying
David Miscavige? Isn't that the Scientology guy?
Yes, totally. He's on my mind too, because where is his wife? But
it's a good question.
Yeah,
that's going to get us canceled faster than saying anything against the U.S. government. We're going to have people at our house.
There's going to be like people outside my door, like filming me. Yeah.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. But David Hogg, yeah, DNC.
Yeah, and then is it Cleta, right?
Yeah, Cleta Mitchell.
And she also runs, like, they named it the Election Integrity Network, which is so funny. That's all I got. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're onto something with like the propaganda of the naming can I think that's what's sinister about memes in general, just how a quick phrase or something that's catchy, and this is why Trump is so good at that, about finding little names that stick in people's minds, is that it replaces all of the content that's meaningful about what's going on. And so all you think about is how catchy this name is and what that means, instead of the fact that it's obscure and all this other stuff. Now, if we're going to keep going through this section with Cleta Mitchell, the thing I wanted to talk about is first couple paragraphs on page 230. So I think her story and all these arguments she's making, everything lead toward a very, I think, good clarification about what democracy means and about what we're actually talking about here. It clarifies people's intentions, and I think all that happens at the top of 230 really well.
All right, so continuing with the story, you just mentioned it. Cleta Mitchell, she was as the head of the group's Election Integrity Network. And just as an aside there, like, we do need to spend more time digging into that, because it's a reflex now for me that anything that's branded as like really pro-patriotic, pro-America, or security or anything like that, I'm automatically suspicious of it. Like it might be totally fine, and it might be just somebody like, oh, like I really do, like, I love the flag. It's like, great, but now these people have made me suspicious of you, and that sucks. But okay, so I'm skipping just a couple chapters here, but it just talks about how she led the EIN, the Election Integrity Network. It was close allies with Heritage Action, and so skipping down to 2 paragraphs. She used those connections, which says those connections to these other right-wing groups that she made at the CPI, the Conservative Policy Institute. She used those connections in 2022 to partner with the RNC and outside groups like Heritage Action to recruit a volunteer army of citizens in key swing states that would be the eyes and ears of the Stop the Steal movement inside election offices and at the polls, determining who was counting the votes and which votes were counted. As Trump himself put it, sometimes the vote counter is more important than the candidate. Mitchell was arming people to fight back against the radical left, she told Steve Bannon, one of the co-architects of the strategy, to keep them from ever stealing it again. Are these active workshops where they actually understand how to take over and grab hold of and control the local apparatus in their local elections, and then to network throughout the country so that we have an apparatus that is unbreakable? Bannon asked Mitchell before a summit in Virginia in April 2022. That's absolutely what we're doing, Mitchell said. Again, I'm going to pause here for a second. So she's basically just admitting that the goal here is to get everybody elected into these strategic positions so that if anything like what happened in 2020 would come back up, this is kind of like the undercurrent, that they would be in control of the apparatus to make it a more positive result for what they were looking for. Okay. At a training session in New Mexico, Eastman explained how these new recruits could gather information that could be used to contest election outcomes. Document what you've seen, raise the challenge, and note which of the judges on the election board declined to accept your challenge. Get it all written down, Eastman said at an Election Integrity Network meeting in Albuquerque. That then becomes the basis for an affidavit in court to challenge after the fact. At a summit for election integrity activists in Arizona in March 2022, co-sponsored by Heritage Action and the Tea Party Patriots, Mitchell explained the ideology that motivated this new movement. The goal of the Democrats, first articulated by Jesse Jackson and more recently by politicians like Stacey Abrams, was to create a new American majority of young people, people of color, unmarried women that would render conservatives obsolete, she said in her Oklahoma drawl at a hotel ballroom in South Phoenix. That's 150 million people, constituting 64% of the people who can vote in America, and they are targeting those groups to change America. Why? What do? They believe you can expand access to democracy by underrepresented populations. It's a place the left sees as great target of opportunity, and we have to make sure that doesn't happen. She ridiculed Democrats and nonprofit groups for trying to register and turn out the vote of the most vulnerable people in our society and wanting to bring democracy to your doorstep. I want to pause right here. We don't live in a democracy. The hundreds of mostly older white activists in the room applauded. For the left, everything is about democracy. The democracy fund, the democracy this, the democracy that. Biden gives speeches about, the attacks on our democracy. We live in a constitutional republic. This frequent conservative refrain was inspired by a 1961 speech in Chicago delivered by Robert Welch, a wealthy candy executive and founder of the far-right John Birch Society, in which he proclaimed, "This is a republic, not a democracy. Let's keep it that way." Welch drew heavily on the history of the founding era, citing the framers' distaste for direct democracy in places like ancient Greece, which Madison defined as a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person. A republic, in contrast, was a government in which the scheme of representation takes place. To Welch, the chief danger in a democracy was majority rule. In a democracy, there is a centralization of governmental power in a simple majority, he said in September 1961. And that, visibly, is the system of government which the enemies of our republic are seeking to impose on us today. Welch believed the Constitution created by the founders was divinely inspired and should not be changed by a majority vote. Those certain unalienable and divine rights cannot be abrogated by the vote of a majority any more than they can by the decree of a conqueror, he said. The idea that the vote of a people, no matter how nearly unanimous, makes or creates or determines what is right or just becomes an absurd and unacceptable as the idea that right and justice are simply whatever a king says they are. To Welch, early 20th century reforms like a progressive income tax and the direct election of U.S. senators were evidence of democracy's dangerous leveling spirit. The expansion of democratic rights in the 1960s was even more frightening. The Birch Society sought to impeach Earl Warren, who they claimed had taken the lead in the drive to convert this country into a democracy, and said the civil rights movement was trying to establish an independent Negro Soviet republic. In reality, the attempt to distinguish between a democracy and a republic was a false dichotomy premised on the misreading of history. Madison strove to combine the two forms of government, creating a democratic republic where representatives would refine and filter the views of the public to achieve an enduring consensus, diminish the influence of any one faction, and protect minority rights. The Constitution could be amended to reflect changing times and circumstances if a sufficiently large majority demanded it. The conservative invocation of a republic, on the other hand, was used throughout U.S. history to protect oligarchies of privilege, such as Southern slaveholders or corporate robber barons, from the pressure of the popular majorities. Under Mitchell's conception of a republic, states had a free hand to pass discriminatory voting laws, and any government action to promote broader political participation violated states' rights and individual liberty. If democracy was the enemy, that justified nearly any attempt by the right to subvert core democratic institutions. This antipathy to democracy was shared not just by the activists Mitchell was recruiting, but by a record number of candidates running for key election positions in the 2022 midterms.
Yeah, there's so much going on here that is just like exactly what we've been trying to talk about for a lot of the podcast. And yeah, I guess I just want to highlight this part at the top of 230 that you'd read, where you're sort of quoting how Madison defined democracy working in ancient Greece. So just this definition that Madison gives, where he says, a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person. That's what a democracy is. I feel like I want to kind of question the first half of that, like a society consisting of a small number of citizens. There's a question of how big a functioning democracy can be, and there's sort of baked into his definition the assumption that it has to be small. I'm not so sure. Given the technologies we have nowadays, there's a greater ability to communicate across vast distances with more number of people, so I'm hopeful about that. But democracy being when people assemble and administer the government in person. The idea that everyone within the democracy is responsible for administering it in some fashion. And that's fundamentally what democracy is, when the people control the government in that direct kind of way. And so what he says right after that about republic, what a republic is, a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, which is the government we got, right? That's what the American system was built on, was the idea of representation. You can't have direct democracy, too complicated, too messy. The founders didn't really want it, actually. And so what we've been handed down is this long train of propaganda about the fact that we live in a democracy. They want the average person to believe that. But then when you look at the mechanisms of how it functions, it looks more and more like a republic, where there's just a scheme of representation. To Welch, early 20th century reforms like progressive income tax and direct election of U.S. senators were evidence of democracy's dangerous leveling spirit. When you go back and read Howard Zinn's history, in the early years of the United States, there was all this drama about leveling. You see that word come up again and again, leveling, and people recognized that there were different tiers in society. There was a ruling class, there were bureaucrats, and then there were the peasants and the slaves and the indigenous people. And a lot of progressive reformers were calling for leveling. They wanted everything to get leveled. And so anytime you see that leveling language, this is what that is calling back to, is this history, this tradition in American history for working class people to use the language of leveling to suggest that wealth needs to be redistributed more evenly. That's been with us since the beginning. And so there's this tension that runs straight through all of American history right up to today about what democracy actually is. What is this ideal that we're all talking about? And how well does it line up with the system we actually have? And so in this book, there's clearly a side that is aligned against that and wants to dismiss democracy, dismantle it, not allow any fingers of democracy to get a hold on the system at all. And then there's the Democratic Party, who we're all perpetually frustrated and annoyed with because they're the ones who are supposed to be standing up for this stuff, right? And so then we sit here and look at what's going on, like, what the fuck are they doing? What are they actually doing about this? Are they doing anything about it? And so for those of us on this, having this kind of view of history, this is the frustrating part of the conversation, is figuring out, who our people are. If there is some institution that's looking out for the actual idea of democracy, where is it? And I think that's what a lot of the millennial politicians are forcing the Democratic Party to answer. You're seeing people in DSA, left-wing people were talking about rent freezes and no more foreign wars, and all these radical ideas are starting to win more and more and more in the Democratic Party primaries and win races and stuff. I think we're just watching this conversation play out in real time. But I thought this section of the book did a really good job of highlighting what we're actually talking about here.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm going to read the last part of 229 one more time. She ridiculed Democrats and nonprofit groups for trying to register and turn out the vote of the most vulnerable people of society and wanting to bring democracy to your doorstep. I want to pause right here. We don't live in a democracy. For the left, everything's about democracy. Democracy fund, democracy this, democracy that. So it's like what I've always had trouble with, I think, is completely putting myself in the same mindset as like a right political activist, right? Because I immediately think, well, okay, they're being hypocritical and they must know they're lying. Like, they're not idiots, right? They've gotten to this high part in the world, like, so they have to know they're lying. But the other, I think, answer to that is almost kind of what you're saying, Joe. They don't look at the Democrats, like the big party Democrats, as being truthful when they're talking about democracy. They look at them like they're full of shit, basically, like is kind of a way you could interpret what she's saying there, right? I think that, like you're saying, there's a long-standing conflict between, two ideological fronts that have lived in the United States since it's been created. But I think where I was going with that was just like the believing the democracy propaganda ourselves, I guess, is the thing. And like you're saying, people are starting to win on the left that are challenging these ideals because they're not automatically just, I guess, falling into that same trap, or it's not clicking for them. Like, the propaganda is not working on the younger generation because they can see in real time, like, the things that are going on that, don't have popular support. I guess I'm just trying to play with this, the propaganda of democracy versus, I don't know, what I was always taught in high school is we're a representative democracy, which is the same thing as what he's saying here with like scheme of representation. So like a flavor of democracy light. I don't know what you want to call it, but but being more honest that this is not a direct democracy or anything like that. Is that kind of where you're going? Does that make any sense? I'm just like thinking about this more.
I think a lot of that makes sense. And I was going to bring it up too, because the idea that you have to delineate different types of democracy should be a kind of red flag right off the bat. Like, what is democracy? It's when the people administer the government in person. Okay, well, what's a direct democracy? Do you know what a tautology is? An argument that spins in circles on itself? What is a direct democracy? A direct democracy is when the people administer the government in person. So it's a democracy. Oh, okay. So what's a representative democracy? Oh, that's when you get the people to pick a handful of other people and to put their trust in those people to administer the government the way they want to. So it's a step removed from actual democracy. And so people are starting to pick up on some of this. And I think with the modern stuff, with some of the people on the left that are winning a lot of these elections, I just think young people recognize the dissonance. Like, it's very obvious between what the ideal is and what we're actually living with. And they're sort of forcing the institutions to the test. They're sort of forcing them to answer these questions and sort of put up or shut up, essentially. Either do what you say you're supposed to be doing, or we're going to put our own people in. And that's what's happening.
Yeah. Probably helps when they just watch a certain class in the United States get, 25 times richer than they were 10 years ago. It's not the class that anyone listening to this podcast is in, probably. But maybe not. Or who knows? Maybe there's a billionaire out there listening to us.
We're a think tank. I'd employ people to listen to this kind of stuff.
So the other thing in this chapter that I wanted to hit on was actually Biden. Biden actually decided to make a speech talking about the threat to our democracy. And the only reason I kind of wanted to bring this up is because, Trump just did his speech, and there was like kind of a parallel there between Trump's speech not being carried by networks because it was too divisive, and Biden's speech also not being carried by multiple networks because it was too divisive. So just interesting that, that's not something that we want to broadcast either way from major political or major media institutions out to a large group of people. And so what I want to read from here is actually on page 337. This is talking a little bit more about that speech. So I'm going to start on the last page the last two paragraphs of 337. The GOP threat to fair elections was brought into sharp relief 2 days later on Halloween when Michaels, during a campaign stop in a small city of Watertown, promised that Republicans will never lose another election in Wisconsin after I'm elected governor. Evers immediately turned Michaels' quote, which seemed to personify how Republicans wanted to make one-party rule voter-proof, into a TV ad. Did you know that Tim Michaels pledged to rig future elections? It said, he'll try to overthrow the will of the people. Is that the kind of divisive radical you want as governor? The White House tried to amplify these warnings, with Biden determined to use the bully pulpit to defeat election denialism with a vigor he did not show until it was too late when it came to passing voting rights legislation. On September 1st, the president visited Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where the Constitution had been drafted, for a primetime speech. The movement to subvert the election system threatened America's experiment as a laboratory for democracy, Biden warned, and sought to delegitimize the very institutions created by the founders. He described the ideals of equality and democracy as the rock upon which this nation is built, and said that they are now under assault. At the root of this new effort to roll back democracy were long contested ideas about freedom and who was entitled to exercise one of the country's most essential rights. I will not stand by and watch the most fundamental freedom in this country, the freedom to vote and have your vote counted, be taken from you, the American people, Biden pledged. Much of the media ignored Biden's speech, deeming it too political. None of the major networks covered it live. ABC aired a game show called Press Your Luck. CBS showed a rerun of Young Sheldon, and NBC an old episode of Law & Order. Less than a week before the election, Biden delivered another primetime address from Union Station in Washington to reiterate what was at stake in the midterms, the first major election since January 6th. I wish I could say the assault on our democracy ended that day, but I cannot, he said, blocks from the Capitol that had been ransacked. As I stand here today, there are candidates running for every level of office in America, for governor, Congress, attorney general, secretary of state, who won't commit to accepting the results of the elections that they're running in. This is the path to chaos in America. It's unprecedented, it's unlawful, and it's un-American. So, was Trump the first time that you guys ever remember any kind of like election denial? Like when it was like, I think even 2016, when he was talking about like, I didn't lose the popular vote. Like, I think that was the first time it started. But for anyone that like wasn't following politics, or even like, I'm guessing like from 2016 to now, it's 10 years. So like election denial is kind of mainstream. I don't know. It's kind of where my head's going like that. Like it at one point, it was almost unthinkable for politicians to deny the outcome of U.S. At least I feel that way. Maybe I'm wrong, but I felt like prior to Trump, like that was a thing that wasn't. And when he started doing that, I remember the huge like pushback on like that as being dangerous. And I don't know, are we just seeing that now where it's become normalized to deny elections? I'm thinking from both ends, like with the Elon stuff, like the election denial for 2024, like it's just more common in the U.S. It's not a norm now to see people questioning the results of our elections. Do you guys agree or disagree? Am I crazy on that?
Yeah, I agree. I don't really remember it being a big thing. Like the transition of power, I was taught in high school, I think a lot, one of the most sacred things, the peaceful transition, to honor the election integrity.
That's what makes us a different country, right?
Exactly. So definitely, I think it is that whole new school stuff.
Yeah, it's like a question of perception, though. Like, I wonder, too, because I feel the same way. Like, I feel like it didn't really start being part of, it wasn't generally accepted to question the election until 2016, and Trump started doing that and everything. But then I was in like 5th or 6th grade during the 2000 election with all the hanging Chad problems. And like, that was one of the major times when the person who won the popular vote lost the electoral college.
Yeah.
I mean, just any case where it's obvious that the popular vote went one way, and the person who won did not win the popular vote, I feel like people are going to rightly question the legitimacy of that.
Yeah.
Maybe this is just our generational perception that it started with Trump, but it definitely feels like it's really widespread in a way that it never was before.
Yeah, and I guess like the good news from this 2022 primary and 2022 midterm, and Arthur, you kind of hit it up front, right? Like most of these, like especially in the Secretary of State races where it was really important because they can control the voting mechanisms, right, for each state. All the election deniers who ran for Secretary of State in the battleground states lost. So that's good. That's a good thing. And it was definitely framed as democracy winning on the ballot. But the fact that, that was such was it 185 of the 308 total election denier candidates, 185 of 308 total election denying candidates across all offices won. Most of those were in Republican areas and Republican districts. But, that is still like a significant, I mean, it's not great. It just helps to entrench power in places where it's already been entrenched even further, right? So it's good that those certain areas were lost, but yeah, not good all around. Chapter 11 was pretty short. I don't know if you guys had any major spots you wanted to hit from Chapter 11, but for me, this was really kind of just talking about the numbers of what actually occurred in the 2022 Georgia election. And so it was kind of going by Georgia's, what was it, SB 202 was the law that Brian Kemp signed in 2021. And that was kind of the voter suppression law in Georgia. So the one thing that I thought was interesting, worth noting, was the number of votes basically that changed between 2018 and 2022. We talked about 2018. Kemp ended up winning against Stacey Abrams, but it was pretty close. It was like 50% to 48. There was like 48.8 or something like that. The margin was around 55,000 votes. And in 2022, so 4 years later, Kemp won by 54% to 45%. So the margin increased by roughly 8 points. What changed? SB 202 went into effect, and that shortened windows, the request for absentee ballots. It had stricter ID requirements for absentee voting. It criminalized giving food and water to voters waiting in line, specifically targeting like the Souls at the Polls groups, which was a Black church tradition of Sunday organizing drives. It restricted the number of drop boxes. It expanded legislative authority to challenge results and take over county election boards, and provisions specifically targeting the infrastructure that turned Georgia blue basically in 2020. So Warnock won the November general election 49.4% to Walker's 48.5%, which was too close for Georgia's 50% threshold, which forced a December 6th runoff. He still won the runoff by 2.8 points, but required a second election against a candidate who had no business being competitive in the first place. And so the quote from election night on Abrams was, while I may not have crossed the finish line, that does not mean we'll ever stop running for a better Georgia. So it kind of like tried to point out that, SB 202, the voter suppression law in Georgia, worked as planned and increased the amount that Brian Kemp was able to win against the same opponent 4 years later. The only other thing in here that was kind of worth mentioning to me was Kris Kobach. He was a big part in the early portions of the book, and he did win the Kansas Attorney General seat in 2002 as well. And he's kind of like the bridge figure. The proof of citizen law in 2013 is kind of like a prototype for what we're seeing now in the SAVE Act at the national level. So worth noting, while a lot of places the election deniers didn't win, Kobach did, and he created the framework for what we're talking about now with the SAVE Act. But anything from you guys on chapter 11 that you wanted to get into at all here?
I think it's like highlighted in chapter 3. We kind of already talked about some of the old school suppression stuff, but the synthesis of these two things like melded together, and it becomes this like machine that creates its own fuel. Like I wrote this Trump quote on 250 at the top in all caps, just so you know. It's unprecedented fraud requires unprecedented cure. Which, wow, it was just like, this whole thing where, they've claimed that fraud happened. You pass a restrictive law because of the fraud that you claim, SB 202 and Florida copies it, Texas copies it, and all these very far right countries copy it. And they're sold as like an explicit response to fraud that if you investigate does not exist. And it just like fuels itself. And that's like the machine that we're in now. And just like how dangerous that is. And yeah, it's not hopeful.
I immediately thought how dangerous that machine is, because that machine basically entrenches single party rule. But that machine is super dangerous for more than one person, because the moment that you're no longer accountable to the people that you represent, that's when revolutions happen. When you stop listening to them. Yeah, I mean, dangerous, not good, definitely not democratic in any way, but hopefully short-sighted. We'll see. I don't know.
And it all just breeds so much distrust in the system itself, in the system that they don't want, which is democracy. And they just keep suppressing it and creating distrust. And then, like they discuss in The Dawn of Everything, like there's just all these different fractions and they're just keeping us split up rather than actually talking about class warfare.
Yeah, I always go back to those 3 forms of domination. Like, what are they like? Trump works with his charisma, like love him or hate him. I hate him, but he has charisma that he uses, right? He has a personality that influences people in a electrifying way. And when that doesn't work, they control information. They do all these weird schemy things to try to control information and make it compartmented and obscure. And trust me, there's a fraud. Don't worry about the details. We'll work it out on the back end, all this stuff. And when those 2 things don't work, they use the third one, which is the monopoly on violence. And so that'll be like the big test, is like people aren't going to put up with this on a massive scale. They're going to reject it. And like, I don't know, that's when atrocities happen, because I don't know, I just think about, there've been a lot of examples of stuff, of the power of like non-violent massive protest in our lifetime. And the one that sticks out most to me is Egypt 2010. There were like millions of people in Tahrir Square just like refusing to leave, like people just basically, going to the bathroom on themselves, refusing to leave until Mubarak, I think it was Mubarak, right? They just, we're not leaving until you get the fuck out of here. And it was one of those moments where it's like, oh, if enough people all agree on a simple demand and refuse to budge, stuff can happen. And so when a government is faced with a situation like that, it's when they have to decide whether or not to turn to that third option of their monopoly on violence. But I think in this age, when information spreads so quickly and everyone has a high quality video and audio recorder in their pocket, it's unlikely for a government to get away with violently clamping down on something like that. So, yeah, I think they tend to go for the first 2, the information and the charisma. And when that doesn't work, they fall back on the violence.
And Egypt's a good example. Also, South Korea has a more recent example of like impeaching and jailing a president for insurrection. And South Korea is pretty capitalist too. So like, there's examples of, capitalist countries actually doing that as well. All right. So jumping into the last official chapter of the book, chapter 12, The Gerrymandering of History, which I thought was an interesting, frame that they've got here, gerrymandering history so that they can gerrymander, the vote, essentially. There's like 3 things that I kind of wanted to hit on in this. The first one is really this piece around Reconstruction and the history of Reconstruction as it was told by white historians immediately following. Like, I feel like my education here in New York was actually pretty good, like in high school and whatnot. Like I at least got the frameworks properly presented to me in high school. But I didn't know, like, that there was such pushback saying, like, oh, Reconstruction was a failure, like, and the fact that that led directly to what was the name of that movie? Birth of a Nation being shown at the White House, like, and like, that was kind of that blew my mind a little bit. Like, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in America was because a video was shown at the White House promoting the Ku Klux Klan in 1950. Like, okay, new information for me to take in. And then, but like going into W.B.D. Du Bois and his basically response to this, I think like I almost feel like we should have that book on our list at some point, Black Reconstruction in America, that kind of takes the opposing view of what was the norm at the time, I think. So the part that I want to read here is actually on page 261, and this kind of goes into a little bit of the details here. This weaponization of history propelled the Lost Cause movement, led by Confederate veterans and their families, which promoted reconciliation efforts with the North by portraying the Civil War not as a fight to maintain slavery, but as a noble struggle to preserve an old-time Southern way of life. As Reconstruction laws were wiped off the books, monuments were erected to Confederate generals throughout the South, with 100,000 people turning out in Richmond, Virginia on Memorial Day 1890 to see the unveiling of a giant statue of Robert E. Lee on horseback. The Southern victory over Reconstruction replaced Union victory in the war, and Jim Crow laws replaced the 14th Amendment in their place of honor in national memory. David Blight wrote in Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory. If students attended a school named after Robert E. Lee, celebrated a holiday honoring him, and passed his statue on the town square every day, and read about the horrors of wars and evils of Reconstruction in their textbooks, they would think that Jim Crow was as American as apple pie. The D.W. Griffith's 19 film, The Birth of the Nation, based on the novel The Klansman by Thomas Dixon Jr., brought this ideology to the mainstream. The son of a Confederate Army colonel in Kentucky, Griffith promoted the most odious racial stereotypes in his 3-hour silent epic depicting black members of the South Carolina legislature barefoot, eating fried chicken and drinking whiskey while passing a law legalizing interracial marriage. A former slave attempts to rape a white woman before the KKK heroically appears on horseback to prevent blacks from voting on Election Day, returning white rule to the South. It was the first film ever shown at the White House, and it revived the KKK, which had been dormant since the end of Reconstruction, but used the film to recruit millions of new members in its second iteration. Ushers dressed in white robes for the screening. So yeah, the fact that was just mainstreamed and basically was mainstreaming white supremacist propaganda to the rest of the country at that point, and restarted the Klan. I think like that was like the first part of here that I was just, I don't know, it kind of blew me away a little bit. I don't think I was ever taught the failure of Reconstruction, if you will. I'm using air quotes there a little bit, but any thoughts on that initial portion of the chapter?
Yeah, I think the way people learn about this period of history, the Civil War and the decades right after it, it's really important. And I feel like my education in high school was incomplete. I know that I'd kind of bounced around. I did the first half of an AP U.S. history class, which went up to the Civil War, but then I didn't do the second half of the class because it was like a 2-semester class. I switched the next semester for some reason. So I don't know how they actually taught the Reconstruction era. I think however my classes were set up, I skipped that part of history and didn't get much of the 20th century stuff either. So I learned about all this stuff in college, but I do remember being kind of shocked the first time I heard that this white supremacist film was shown at the White House and sort of revived the Klan and everything. And I think the tone of the historical lesson was there I went to high school in South Carolina, and I remember the kind of tone when our teacher was talking to us about like the Civil War era and everything before it and everything. There was always this kind of strange irony he would use in his voice that kind of made me feel like he was skeptical about progressive sort of reforms and stuff. And so I definitely got the vibe of what the book is talking about here, but I didn't really understand what his point was at the time. It's only like in retrospect I'm thinking that might have been his view. But anyway, yeah, this is an important way to teach us, and it shows us how the way we learn about history drastically changed our view of it. And it's why Howard Zinn's book is important for understanding a big view of history. But it's what W.E.B. Du Bois does with his rewriting of this period, is he just like very carefully sociologically breaks down what happened and shows how you've been misled. He published that, 1935? So by that point, several white historians have already sort of laid their claim to the territory of Reconstruction in a certain way that's obviously racist and biased and incomplete. So again, the people who want to get the facts straight are not only having to get the facts straight, but having to combat this narrative of propaganda that's built up in the meantime. And so doing both of those things is really difficult, which is what we're trying to do right now with like the whole American politics since Obama stuff that's gotten all obscured and everything.
Yeah, I totally went with like this high school, middle school education, like who your teacher is like so much more important than so many other roles in life, that teachers not only should be paid, at minimum like $100K a year and have full benefits, but the qualifications should be like more rigorous, and it should be more like, that should be such a great job. I think that is the basis. And I found when they were talking about W.B. Du Bois, and I was thinking of 2016, the Secretary of Education that Trump had.
Yeah, Betsy
And
DeVos. Yeah.
Betsy DeVos, and she had her kids in private school. She was in charge of education, and she gutted everything. And that's like, that was the basis of everything to come, I think, here. And the whole, like, when you let a certain state like Oklahoma or Texas, revise books and only, teach kids one thing, like, I'm not for it. I'm for some real leftist education. We need like a federal mandate across this stuff. It's horrible, because the way that you are taught, like if you don't know about the 3/5 compromise or something, and you think it's a good, I don't know. It's just horrible.
Well, you mentioned federal mandate, because like you'll get a very different education if you go to New York versus Oklahoma. Like, I mean, my family spent time in both school systems. I think I had a relative who was in New York schools up until, what was it, I think 10th grade. So did 11th and 12th in Oklahoma. And like the level of education and what they get into is completely, very, very different just depending on where you grow up, which sucks. It's not great. It's not setting everyone for a good footing, And they get into that too with in this chapter, which is the next couple things that I wanted to talk about. But anything else before I hit those?
The only other thing I had was, as like an aside, I remember reading about W.B. Du Bois and how he was like ousted at the NAACP for his like too leftist of ideals. And in college, I learned that he thought that the Black liberation was like tied to class liberation, which I loved. And, like Hakeem Jeffries does not think that. He thinks, something very different today. And I just love and I think we see that because Betsy, who guts the public school infrastructure but has kids in private school, it shows it is a class issue. It's like what class is going to be taught what. So do you believe that poorer people should be less educated? That's like, no. I don't know. That was my only last thing, I guess.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because like before we met today, I had a few minutes, I was just reading some of the first material in the new Jim Crow, Cornel West's preface and everything. And I think this intersection that you're pointing out between race and class is really the crux of what Michelle Alexander is going to talk about, Jim Crow. And once you get into college and stuff, you hear terms like intersectional politics, and you're not really sure what it means. It just kind of sounds like buzzwords and stuff. But this is actually what it's pointing at, is that when you break down how society is shaped sociologically, demographically, you have different groups that are affected by different conditions. And when you intersect some of these things and look at what happens when you zoom in on that nexus of intersection between two or more of these factors, you see really interesting things happen. And when you look at American history, the intersection of race and class, the most interesting places to look. And it's really important to understand.
So I had this I wanted to kind of read from 264 and 265. I'm going to skip this, but I would say it's another just great example of courts picking specific or cherry picking their history to come up with a ruling that they wanted to. This was talking about Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, which overturned, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned Roe v. Wade. was kind of going to Samuel Alito, but I won't read the whole thing, but I do just want to read this one portion of it. Alito wrote, "It must be deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. But until the Roe decision in 1973, the right to abortion was entirely unknown in American law," he wrote. "When the 14th Amendment was adopted, 3/4 of the states made abortion a crime at all stages of pregnancy. He was interpreting the rights of women based on a period 50 years before they had the right to vote." I think just that statement in general, anytime you're interpreting history from a period where they have less rights than they have today, maybe you shouldn't use that history. I don't know. It doesn't seem like a good time to pull from. But anyway, it was also wrong, because why would it be correct? Samuel Alito doesn't need to look into that. All right. So the last...
Yeah, I was just going to say, when you read he was interpreting the rights, it was like, just stop. No need.
All right. So the last thing I wanted to hit on for this chapter was talking about Forsyth County. This is something I didn't know about at all until I read this book the first time. So I'm going to read a couple pages here, starting on 268. So on September 9th, 1912, Sleety Mae Crow, an 18-year-old girl in Georgia's Forsyth County, was found beaten and unconscious on the banks of the Chattahoochee River, 30 miles north of Atlanta in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The next day, the county sheriff arrested 3 black men who were allegedly seen in the area despite no physical evidence or motive linking them to the crime. When 24-year-old Rob Edwards, known as Big Rob, was taken to the jail in the county seat of Cumming, a mob of 2,000 whites overwhelmed the single deputy guarding him. They beat Edwards with a crowbar, shot him repeatedly, and dragged him through the streets before hanging his mutilated body from a telephone pole in the town square. 2 black teenagers, Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel, were tried and convicted in a single day. 5,000 people, half the population of Forsyth County, watched their hangings. After Crow was buried, armed white men on horseback with guns, dynamite, and kerosene went door to door at night in the black community, burning down houses and telling residents to leave within 24 hours or be killed. Within a week, nearly all 1,098 black residents had fled. Only 30 black people remained by 1920, and soon they would leave too. It was the largest expulsion of black people from a single county in American history. 75 years later, in January 1987, the civil rights activist Hosea Williams, who marched next to John Lewis on Bloody Sunday, led a small group of 50 black and white demonstrators through Forsyth County, which at the time contained only 1 black resident out of the population of 30,000, to commemorate the racial expulsion and celebrate the newly created Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. A much larger crowd of angry whites, including members of the Klan, threw bottles and rocks at Williams as he sang "We Shall Overcome." They carried Confederate flags, shouted "N-word, go home," and held signs that said "Racial purity is Forsyth's security." It wasn't until the winter of 2021, 109 years after the expulsion, that the Community Remembrance Project of Forsyth County unveiled a blue historical marker in the town square of Cumming to mark where Edwards was lynched and detail the mob violence that forced black residents to flee. It was a small symbol of how the country was finally grappling with its racist past.
It's like an echo of the same thing that we just discussed prior with the whole machine and its self-sustaining engine or fuel. Like, there's zero evidence on these people, and before any evidence can come forward, I mean, I guess 2 were convicted within a day, right?
Yeah,
As Trump would call it, quick trial. But like, there's zero evidence on these people. They kill them before they have any say, and then they use that as justification.
Yeah, to push out all the rest
just
of the black residents. Yeah. When I read this, it actually reminded me of the first time I watched the Watchmen series on HBO and saw the Tulsa massacre. I hadn't known about that until I watched that show, and then I was like, this shit was real? Like, holy crap. But yeah, that's what this reminded me of, this detailing of what occurred in Forsyth County in Georgia. So that was kind of the background. The previous summer, after the murder of George Floyd and other unarmed black men and women at the hands of police, between 15 to 26 million people marched in support of Black Lives Matter movement, the largest mass demonstrations in American history. 3/4 of Americans said racism and racial discrimination were a big problem in society, up 26 points from 2015. Books about anti-racism shot to the top of the bestseller list. The U.S. military said it would change the names of 9 bases commemorating Confederate generals. Statues honoring the likes of Calhoun and Lee were removed from cities such as Charleston and Richmond. Fairfax, Virginia, renamed Robert E. Lee High School after John Lewis. But as was often the case throughout American history, this racial reckoning, as Biden called it, led to an equally potent counter-reckoning among aggrieved conservative whites. Trump fanned the flames of white grievance, calling Black Lives Matter activists domestic terrorists and denouncing the effort to remove symbols of the Confederacy. Our nation is witnessing a merciless campaign to wipe out our history, defame our heroes, erase our values, and indoctrinate our children, Trump said during a speech at Mount Rushmore on July 3rd, 2020. I got to stop there. Yeah, so I mean, as we're talking about removing all of these Confederate things, that's what Trump says. We're erasing our heroes and our values and indoctrinating our children. Okay. All right. So that fall, he authorized the creation of the 1776 Commission to restore patriotic education. It was dominated by members of conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and Claremont Institute, but included no historians of the United States. The commission issued its report 2 days before Trump left office. It likened progressivism to fascism and slavery as challenges to America's principles, and compared the pro-life movement to great reforms such as abolition. Though released on Martin Luther King Day, it claimed that the civil rights movement almost immediately turned to programs that ran counter to the lofty ideals of the founders, not unlike those advanced by Calhoun and his followers. Historians quickly dismissed the report as right-wing agitprop. They're using something they call history to stoke culture wars, said James Grossman, the executive director of American Historical Association. But some scholars warned that historians ignored it at their own peril. The 1776 report will undoubtedly shape deliberations about history and social studies education at the local and state levels, especially in places where right-wing activists had taken over educational policymaking, predicted New York University historian Tom Segura. Creating your version of history and then using your version of history to justify further actions here. So the reason that it set up the Forsyth County example at the beginning of this is because Brian Kemp made a trip to Forsyth County, and I'm reading here from that same page 270, not to visit the lynching memorial, but to sign a bill banning the teaching of divisive concepts in K-12 schools. The concepts prohibited under the Protect Students First Act included the idea that the United States of America is fundamentally racist, and that a student bears individual responsibility for actions committed in the past by other individuals of the same race, or should feel anguish, guilt, or any form of psychological distress from instances of racism. It ignored the distress of actually being subjected to racism. We put students and parents first by keeping woke politics out of the classroom, the governor said at a local education center just a few miles from where Edwards had been lynched before a nearly all-white group of state legislators, parents, and students. Months earlier, the Forsyth County School District, after protests from white parents, had banned 8 books for allegedly explicit material, including Toni Morrison's debut novel, The Bluest Eye. Kemp didn't mention the irony of signing a new law preventing teachers from addressing America's racist past in a county that had forcibly expelled all of its black residents a century later. What supports white supremacy more than making rules to say you can't talk about racism or white supremacy? Asked Josh Howard, a Democratic candidate for state superintendent of education. The Georgia bill followed a flurry of similar laws passed by GOP-controlled legislatures. Texas prohibited the teaching of slavery and racism or anything other than deviations from, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States, which included liberty and equality, and Kentucky stated that the institution of slavery and post-Civil War laws enforcing racial segregation and discrimination were contrary to the fundamental American promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, but that defining racial disparities solely on the legacy of this institution is destructive to the unification of our nation. So, again, kind of going back to what you were saying, Arthur, with like this system, right? Control the education, or Joe, our methods of power, controlling the information that people are allowed to learn so that they can't be upset about the previous injustices that have been done against either them or others on their behalf.
Interesting that they always find these tiny little counties where it's all the right-wing white people, you know? And that's like where they do these incubations, which I think today we see that politically and with like data centers, you know, there's just wreaking havoc. But the education here, I thought, like, of course they want to suppress it because I remember reading studies, I don't have one in my head, but I remember reading that like there is a strong, well-documented statistical correlation between higher education and identifying as Democratic or having like more socially liberal viewpoints. And so if you suppress that in these states that are already red and support that, like, of course you get more GOP voters and you kind of raise the next ilk to, you know, propagate this stuff. So it makes total sense, but it's like another, it's just another example of like say and do gap of what they're doing and what they're saying.
Yeah. It's also this stuff, this section here, especially about like all the books they're banning and how they're trying to manipulate education and everything. It just makes it important to understand what's going on with education and why they're trying to ban books and stuff. I read The Bluest Eye earlier this year. Toni Morrison is a phenomenally talented writer, writes the most beautiful sentences I've ever read in my life. Just a really, really good writer, really great novel. And The Bluest Eye, the worst thing that's going to happen to you if you read The Bluest Eye is that you would develop empathy for Black children. And if you develop empathy for Black children and then make political assumptions based on that empathy, why are they afraid of that? You know, it just begs the question of what they're actually what do they think, these right-wing people, what do they think education is for, if not to broaden your perspectives, help you understand different points of view other than your own, help you understand your place in a wider world, and help you feel more deeply connected to people outside of your tiny little circle. That's what I think education is for making me feel connected to something bigger than myself and to understand the world I live in a deeper way. And that's what novels do. They develop your point of view. They develop your empathy. They develop your empathic muscles. So yeah, it's just always kind of tragic to see them want to ban novels and stuff, especially Toni Morrison novels, which I don't know. I have a hard time understanding why people don't like her novels.
You might have just kind of hit it. There's a effort to certainly say that empathy is a bad thing. I mean, Musk does that all the time. He says like empathy is a weakness, and I think it goes into this whole like, this narrative around how the world really works. Like, you like get that statement like, well, yeah, empathy's great. It'd be great but that's not how the world really works. And I'm the more realistic person because I'm looking at the world in this, like dog eat dog world or whatever you want to call it, right? Like, gotta watch out for yourself. And if you're too empathetic, it's like, it can actually bring the Western civilization down or some shit. But also propaganda doesn't work as well. When you know people that are real human beings and you talk to them, you can empathize with them, then when someone else tries to scapegoat that group of people, it doesn't work as well. Like, if you're taught like the true history of what Black Americans had to go through, then it doesn't work as well when you try to just say, oh, these people are just lazy. It's a race. Like it's a whole thing. They're taking money. Like that doesn't work when you actually know and like try to learn and experience what other people have gone through. So I think you're hitting it, Joe. Like that's why they just don't want people to be able to, connect with anyone that isn't the group that they're trying to promote. Also, maybe there's just a deep-seated like self-hatred about everything they just don't want to face. Like that was the quote here that he said, like, children shouldn't feel, what's the word? I want to read this.
Was it the bottom of 270? They shouldn't feel the guilt, anguish,
Yeah.
guilt.
Yeah. That United States among America is fundamentally racist. I mean, structurally racist. You could obviously. And then bears individual responsibility for actions committed in the past by others of the same race, or should feel anguish, guilt, or some form of psychological distress. I don't know. You should feel some form of psychological distress when you learn things about the past that are terrible. Like, I mean, that's the point of learning about them. Like, you shouldn't just feel good all the time. Like, if you feel good all the time, then you're being fed like bullshit, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. But the part that I do get is like, you don't bear any individual responsibility for the actions that have been committed in the past. Like, you didn't do that. But if you benefit from it, then maybe there's a way that you can try and correct some of those things. If you learn about it, then at least you're aware of what occurred and you're not continuing to propagate like, actions now that can harm those same groups of people, right? So let's close this out. The book ends on an epilogue, A New Laboratory for Democracy, and it talks about a couple of pretty cool things that happened. To tie this back to what we were talking about earlier with the DNC, after reading about Ben Wikler and finding out that it was between him and the current guy who's running the DNC, Ken Martin, that it was between Ben Wikler and Ken Martin for running the DNC. The fact that they went with Ken Martin and everything that's going on now makes me very sad, because it was really I like an uplifting epilogue to me because it talked about like two things. I won't go into super detail, but one, Michigan, a person named Katie Fahey who created a group called Voters Not Politicians that actually was able to get ballot initiatives on there to combat gerrymandering in Michigan. And it worked. Like it actually, like the ballot initiative passed. They got new nonpartisan groups to redraw lines, and then the actual vote tallies came in, and the representation was more aligned to the popular vote tallies. So that was like great to see. Like there are ways for that to work. And then it was talking about Ben Wikler and like the domino strategy. The thing that I loved about that was the fact that Ben was clear-eyed in saying like not just, oh, we just need to get vote out, we just need to win these elections. It was like there are specific offices that need to be gone after first, second, third, like in order to structurally reshape Wisconsin, like really focusing in on like certain races in the judicial area first, right? Like he had a tactical plan to actually retake the state and turn it into more of a laboratory for democracy, as the chapter is titled. It's a great way to end the book, right? It shows you a couple spots of I think hope, and also a little methods for how you take back democracy. You use essentially the same playbook that oligarchs did to turn it more towards oligarchy, right? Like they've got a similar playbook that we can use. I think it's not like a fully uplifting chapter, obviously, because these are two victories in a much larger, I think, political battle. But anyway, yeah, anything from you guys on this last epilogue?
No, I think I thought you nailed it. I was really impressed. I didn't know about the same day voter registration thing, which I think is like so cool. And automatic voter registration seems like a no-brainer. I thought, yeah, it was totally hopeful where like if the Constitution or the federal democracy that we have is set up to kind of like have this will of, the minority can kind of influence it. States are the place where the majority of people can come together and you can still fight that. And it seemed like Michigan had some really repeatable things that it put into place that other states could echo. So I found it to be helpful too.
Yeah, same. I'm a big fan of the ballot initiatives. Just like within the system we've got, that is one way we can sort of get something that closer approximates direct democracy. Because anytime you can get a really strong ballot initiative that will actually do something for people's lives. Big fan of that. Let's get national ballot initiatives going. I would love to see a national federal ballot initiative next time.
As an aside, I was driving from Bend. I just went to go visit my mom. And I thought of you, Joe, because there was this guy's sign on the highway that said, no to ranked choice voting. What? I was putting that out there. Nobody's arguing. No, whatever. It was just so funny. But it was the first anti I've seen on a sign for that. But yeah, we should definitely have national ballot initiatives and ranked choice for fourth.
Here.
Yeah, on the ballot initiatives part, on page 284, it kind of talks about how this, I'm going to read a little bit of the chapter up here, but it said the public sentiment in Wisconsin recalled the conditions that led to reformers to lobby for ballot initiatives at the turn of the 20th century. So it's kind of like talking about where did ballot initiatives come from? With Jim Crow firmly entrenched in the South and corporate robber barons and corrupt party bosses in control of much of the industrial North, there were growing complaints that democratic institutions were no longer responsive to popular demands. Strange, huh? This outrage led to a new movement for direct democracy. In 1898, South Dakota became the first to adopt the initiative and referendum process. Over the next 2 decades, nearly 20 more states followed suit, including Michigan in 1908. Voters organized and passed a series of initiatives to boost representative democracy through reforms like the direct election of senators, women's suffrage, abolition of the poll tax, and the power to recall public officials. William S. Urin, a reform activist in Oregon who led the People's Power League, called the ballot initiative the best means available for overthrowing government by the plutocracy in the American states. These state-based efforts laid the groundwork for the constitutional amendments that were enshrined during the Progressive Era. I think that paragraph, or those 2 paragraphs right there, is really the nail on the head for me of what Berman's trying to get across. We may not have power right now at the federal level. The federal level is very difficult to change. We talked about it here, constitutional amendments, like how do we even get to that spot? But the states do have power. And I think what Berman is hoping is that more states will try to become laboratories for democracy and try out these new things like we've seen with different ranked choice voting in some states, different, medical conglomerations with East and West Coast states, and all these different things that people are trying at the state level to make things better. But maybe there's a scenario where after Trump, if a progressive somehow gets into power and has enough political will, that they can use these experiments that the states have done to try and codify some of this at the federal level. Because just getting it through a federal, it's going to be very difficult. Any last comments on the book? What do you guys think? Would you recommend this to others? Do you think? I know it clearly has a pretty liberal bias in the book. It really talks about what the Republicans have done over the last, a long time, like back to Reagan, but doesn't really go into the Democrats as much. It does talk about some of their failings, but I'm sure there could be a similar book written on Democratic strategies for taking power. And man, that wouldn't be a great seller because obviously it hasn't worked well for them so far. But yeah, any thoughts? Any last thoughts for this book?
Definitely would recommend. It's, I think, like what Joe said earlier, like it's really interesting to see like the minutia of like what is going on and underpinning some of these, because I thought that I maybe knew about, this as like a larger narrative and story, but learning the actual details and reading the phone calls and all of these things, it just opens your brain even more to more liberal beliefs.
Yeah. I don't know if I have anything to add necessarily. With political books like this, like you were saying, Cody, there's obviously some sort of, especially when they're modern and they cover like a narrow period of history, there tends to be some sort of bias. And like, if you can have the right perspective, you can read anybody's book and still get something out of it. I could probably read some conservative intellectual's book, and as long as I keep my head wrapped around that perspective in a certain way, I could still get something out of the book. And yeah, there's a lot left on the table in terms of what the Democratic Party is doing that's anti-democratic, ironically. We could relitigate the primaries of 2016 and 2020 and all that if we wanted to. But yeah, it's a book worth reading if you really want to understand the lengths to which not only Trump, but the Republican Party more largely, the lengths to which they've gone to try to undermine the will of people. If that matters to you and you want to learn more about it, you should absolutely read the book.
I think last thing I'd say is it also really highlights the level of coordination that they have, which I think is the thing that, didn't surprise me the most, but like just, it's a lot to push it back against, I guess, is what I would say. But all right. So that's it for Minority Rule, the right-wing attack on the will of the people and the fight to resist it by Ari Berman. That covers book one for book club this year. Before we go, Arthur, do you want to tell people about the next book we'll be reading?
Yeah. We got The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Michelle Alexander is a litigator and a civil rights lawyer. The book itself, I think this book has kind of been about minority rule and how the minority rule has kind of messed with the voting rights and maybe people's personal vote. This book gets into a really interesting other side, which is people who don't have the right to vote and whose votes don't count at all. And, really we're in this age of mass incarceration in the country. And Michelle Alexander gets into why for-profit prisons need a steady rate of human bodies to stay in business, and how recidivistic rates or recidivism, which is like the rate in which people return to prison, basically functions as a system feeding itself. And we get back to kind of the same questions maybe that this book has of like, how do you kind of sell this hierarchical caste system, to a country that already tells itself that racism has been fixed? And it was written a few years ago, so I'm going to be looking forward to seeing, how it's changed and how kind of, that whole background emerges. So grab the book. It's online. I can't support Amazon, but Abe's Books, or something. I can't publicly, I don't know. Go to your local bookstore and ask them to order it. As an aside, I thought a cool companion reader would be Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. Right?
Okay.
So just a little small book
Yeah.
if people want to read. It's a little bit shorter.
Going to be interested in how this compares to current geo-group detention centers and what's happening with all of that as well. Like if there's through lines that we can pull into that. All right. Well, thanks for listening. We are off next week, but we will be back on the feed our second week of August, and we'll have another core episode out with our first episode for the next book. So, all right. Have a good one. Bye.
That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone who would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time.
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
Propaganda loves you.